Yeah, that's fine.
And I'm going to stop sharing so you guys can do it.
Okay, so I want to introduce Karen. We were talking a little bit before the meeting officially got started, but Karen is with us tonight. She's one of the directors of KOI, and KOI is a not-for-profit organization created by advanced hobbyists to help people keep their koi healthy and happy and just to enjoy their ponds overall. They have a huge website, which I did a lot of poking around in, and they teach a lot of different courses about koi and ponds and all kinds of useful information for this hobby. Karen herself has been a koi keeper for more than 40 years, and she has a 50,000 gallon pond. I first thought that was a typo, and so I questioned her about it, and I heard a little bit of the story about how kind of the excavator kind of went wild a couple of days she had them there. So it really is a huge pond, and I really enjoyed visiting with Karen. Please feel free to ask questions as we go, but I'm going to turn it over to Karen at this point to talk to us about koi diseases and how to prevent them and how to just keep our fish healthy in general.
Super. Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you, Lisa. It's very nice of you folks to invite me here this evening. I love attending different clubs, and it's so great that we can do this over Zoom. So I'm going to start my screen share, and we'll see if we can get everybody on the same page. Then again, there it is. And as Rebecca was saying, because we have so few people here tonight, let's just make this more of a conversation, and please feel free to jump in and ask questions or throw in some more information if you've got it. We'll all learn from each other. That'll be fun. Okay. Everybody seeing the screen okay? Any problems? Everybody okay? It's showing
No
up.
problem.
Okay, that's
good, Karen.
That's like a first. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about why disease prevention is much better than trying to treat it. A little bit about things that can cause disease, where they come from, and maybe the most useful thing will be something that we do in our KOI certification labs, where we try to help people to figure out pond problems by breaking them into categories. And so we've determined that pretty much everything falls into one of these four categories: either water quality, parasites, bacteria, or virus. And what you should do is look at each category and then try to round up all the likely suspects. What could be happening with water quality that could produce the results that you're seeing in your pond? What kind of parasites could be producing the problem you're seeing? And then once you've got a list of all the subjects, then it's pretty easy to go through and figure out what kind of tests you need to do to rule each one out. And hopefully the one you're left with is the real answer. That's sort of the system that we propose and try to help people learn, and it works for most folks. And we're going to just touch on real sort of base level of those things tonight. But and then the other important thing that I'm hoping you'll get out of it is a little bit about quarantine, why we are quarantining, and then a couple of quick tips on how to do it cheaply and easily. Whoops, I'm jumping here. Come on, machine. Try it again. Preventing disease. Okay, so prevention is always easier than curing. You know, I say this to everybody I talk to, but the Japanese don't talk about keeping koi. They talk about keeping beautiful water. And one of the most important things you can do is become familiar with the water in your pond. My pond water changes, and it changes seasonally. And the numbers can look quite different between summer and winter and fall and spring. And the only way that you're going to learn that about your pond is to actually chart it. So take the water quality tests that hopefully Kevin has taught you to do. And after you get the results, write them down. And if you're good at things like Excel or, one of the other computer programs, you can use that. If worse comes to worse, just keep a list of a table on a piece of paper so that you start to become familiar with what's normal in your pond and how that can change. What you're really looking for is changes, not so much any specific number, but in changes. Testing, we always say if you're just starting a pond or starting a filter, you need to do it daily. If you're a crazy person like me keeping fish in the basement while you're building a pond, you probably need to do the testing twice a day because you're so overcrowded with such a small pond. But if your filter is working, you probably don't need to test much more than weekly. But in the winter, you should still test. Now, you folks have no excuse because you don't have ice on the ponds. I have to test through the ice. So I always make sure I've got a stock tank heater so that I've got a hole in the ice so I can grab some water for testing at least monthly. It's hard. If things start to go out of whack, you may need in your pond, depending on the size of the pond, the smaller the pond, the more frequently you're going to need to test. With 50,000 gallons, monthly should do it. The problem, we always talk about the yin and the yang. For every good thing, there's a bad thing. And we'll talk about that in disease treatment as well. But the problem with a big pond is that, nothing changes very fast, and that's good. But the downside of that is if things start to go south, oh boy, is it hard to get them fixed because it's a really big pond and it takes a lot of treatment. So learning to figure out what your testing schedule should be is really important. And if I can leave you with one thought for the evening, and that's be a good observer. Learn to spend time watching your koi. This is supposed to be the advantage of owning a koi pond, but it's also super important to catching problems when you can still fix them, and certainly before it kills koi, but maybe before it even makes them very sick, so that it's real easy to reverse the problem. Think about things that could stress your koi. One of the little activities we did one time at a koi party was make a list of all the things that stress your koi. I mean, it's basically endless. If you look at them sideways, sometimes they stress from that. The local dog jumps in the pond, that's very stressful. My husband dangling his feet in the pond, the fish consider that stressful. Almost anything, but especially if you, for any reason, have to net the koi or confine them into one area of the pond, like you're cleaning and you want them all to stay on one end. Any kind of predation, you've been visited by the great blue heron, spawning, incredibly stressful. The very first time I had a spawn in the 50,000 gallon pond, some of those fish had been in a smaller pond and hadn't spawned for years. And the first time they spawned in the big pond, probably released so much poisonous toxins that two of the fish actually died from spawning. So, if they spawn every year, it's not as much of a problem, but that's a little bit like the problem of egg binding, that it can certainly cause fatalities in the koi. And of course, you're looking for, are any fish alone? Are all your fish eating? Is there one of them who's not eating? Some fish have different eating habits. Some fish don't like to go into the middle of the melee when all the fish are grabbing for food, and they don't like being bumped and jostled. Some koi prefer to eat on the bottom. Some koi prefer to eat by themselves. One of the things that can really help is to make sure you always broadcast your food over all the pond surface, or at least as much of it as you can. That's hard if you have an auto feeder. and the auto feeder goes off, it dumps the food in a small area. But if you're hand feeding, do broadcast your food and give all the fish as much opportunity as they can to get to the food, without interfering with other ones. And there's always going to be two of them going for the same pellet, but hopefully by broadcasting it, you give all of them more of a chance to eat. Make sure you're looking for any scrapes, any sores, sunburn. Do you know, koi, the sunburn? Absolutely, especially if they have white noses. Horses with white noses sunburn, but so do koi. Look for any odd behavior. I don't know what's odd behavior for a koi. Let's say corkscrew swimming. That's always a good one. That's a sign that the fish have been exposed to poison, some kind of toxin. Any behavior that you're not used to seeing. So, it could be a lot of different things, but again, watch your fish and spend some time getting to know, each fish's normal respiration rate. So, which fish are breathing faster? Do they all have about the same respiration rate, or are the big ones faster? Are the little ones faster? If you get to know what's normal, then you'll be able to see what's abnormal. And that's another good thing. Write down what you think is normal for each of the koi. And then, check it again a year later and see if that's changed as the fish has aged. So,
Karen?
healthy pond water.
Karen, I got a quick question.
Sure.
You mentioned the koi's different feeding habits. I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to that, but I have a lot of fish. Anyway, there are several people that I know that feed using a feeding ring.
Yes.
And based on what you just said, I think that's probably not the best idea, right?
Well, the reason you use a feeding ring is to try to keep the feed out of the skimmers, right?
Okay.
So perhaps a better solution would be to turn off the skimmers while your fish are eating. If you're really feeding a proper amount, and I'm not one of those proponents of all the fish have to eat every last morsel in 5 minutes, a half an hour. I mean, I personally don't like to wolf down my dinner in 5 minutes. I'd rather spend, half an hour sitting there calmly and enjoying it. And I think if the koi are calm and if they're well fed, they will take more than 5 or 10 minutes to eat. You tend to see the real aggressive feeding behavior only in overcrowded situations. And so using a feeding ring, while it has, here's the yin and yang again, while it has an advantage and it keeps the food out of the skimmer, it concentrates the food and causes them to damage each other. Koi can bump each other so hard, and not only they bruise, but they can damage fins. They can, really hurt each other. I, at one point, purchased a really nice showfish, and apparently it had been in some kind of feeding fracas when it was young, and it would not compete for food at the surface. If there was any left over at the end, it would eat it, or it would eat sinking food, but it would not come to the surface with other koi. And now I've heard from lots of people that they have a koi in their pond that's similar to that. So I think the point is to try to keep the food in the pond and give the fish as much opportunity as they can. So that means maybe turning off some kind of circulation, turning off skimmers, turning off waterfalls, broadcasting the food in as much area as possible. I think it can be very helpful. It's especially important if your pond is crowded, that each fish has a place to go to get something to eat without having to compete for it. The competition is really stressful. Crowding is super stressful for the koi. And we see so much more disease in ponds that are overcrowded than in ponds that are undercrowded. Right?
That makes great sense. And the feeding rings I've seen are tiny.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to watch them come up and grab that food, but I'm with you. Yeah. I've started broadcasting mine like way further out than where my feeding deck is. So it's further away from the skimmer. So it's not getting and you know, I have plants in my pond, as do many of us in this group.
But
That
that's
way I'm
good.
not
That
getting
means,
the food trapped in there and it's not going in the skimmer.
yeah, I mean, you know, the plants actually will help slow down the feeding because it will trap the food, and then the koi can go noodle around and pick it out, and that's actually very healthy. And I'm a big proponent of plants in ponds, other than the fish eating them or turning them into volleyballs and playing with them. You know, if you have your plants protected, and you can, I'm a firm believer that it improves water quality. Um, but you do have to deal with the bad downside of the water quality, which is all the detritus from the plants, and making sure that you're keeping things clean. So, you know, here we are, healthy pond water. We could say healthy pond water needs some way to get rid of um, the nitrates that are the end of the nitrification cycle. How do you get that out of a pond? Well, if you don't have plants, you're going to have to do lots and lots and lots of water changes. And these days, I mean, koi can survive very heavy amounts of nitrate on a regular basis. When I started in the hobby, we used to say 50 was an average amount and up to 200 was okay. The current thinking is that if you have a showfish and you're trying to get great whites, you need to keep your nitrates under 10 parts per million, and even better under 5. And that's virtually impossible in any kind of, if you don't have like ozone or reverse osmosis or a ton of plants, it's almost impossible. So in addition to, you know, wanting to get rid of nitrate, you do need to have circulation in the pond. The bottom drain makes it act like a toilet so that all the bad stuff is being flushed out. Having lots of filtration, lots of oxygen really helps keep your koi healthy. And remember that their slime coat is your best defense. Nature has evolved it with millions of years, and it's not only anti-parasitical, it's antibacterial. Won't do much for virus, but works for everything else. So we should talk just for a minute about stress. Stress in most ponds comes from water quality issues. Maybe not in your pond, but in most of the problem ponds that we get called in to help people with, it's a water quality thing. And remember that stress is cumulative. Every little stressor adds up. And it's not just one stressor that hurts a koi. If you put together 10 stressors, any one of them will have no effect whatsoever. But when they accumulate, now all of a sudden fish get sick. And so think about all the things that have been going on in your pond, not just today, but in the past month. And we know that a really heavy stressor, like stuffing the fish in a bag and hauling it off to a koi show, that can take more than 3 months for the koi to recover from that kind of stress. And in some cases, if there's gill damage, it can take up to 6 months. So it's a long, long recovery from something that may not seem really harmful at the time. Stresses, yeah, short list here. It's a really short list. Temperature changes more than 5 degrees up or 2 degrees down in a single day. Any ammonia or nitrite, any nitrates. KOI recommends trying to keep your nitrate under 20 parts per million. My old teachers who were saying 50 were probably a little bit high on that. Ammonia and nitrite both can burn the gills. Nitrite causes brown blood disease, which makes it hard for them to breathe. So one of the symptoms of nitrite poisoning is seeing your koi clustered around an air source. So if you see that, you have to assume that anytime you see the fish clustered around a waterfall or an air stone, you've got to think you might have a water quality issue or something that has damaged the koi's gills. And therefore they're trying really hard to get oxygen. While this may not agree with all the literature, pH changes are really not hard on koi. Koi are well evolved to handle pH changes. Now, if it's changing a lot every day, that's completely different. But generally, a single pH change or even a big pH change is not really damaging to the koi. Remember that low oxygen affects the large koi first. and that any problems, water quality problems, stress problems, all reduce their slime coat. And so when you reduce the line of defense, now you've got problems because the little buggers are always out there in the system. And the first thing that swims by is going to attack a koi that doesn't have an immune system. So think a little bit about how do we get problems in our ponds? So debris is perhaps the most common. Fish poop, extra food, algae, plant matter, anything, leaves that have fallen off plants, things that blow into the pond. Fish to fish contact. Have you recently added new fish? Fish love to bump and nuzzle. You will see them always touching each other. And basically any problem one has gets very quickly moved to other fish. And then you need to think a little bit about your biosecurity in your pond. Are you using a net in 2 different tanks, or in a quarantine tank and then into the main pond, into 2 different ponds? If you have multiple ponds or multiple places where you keep fish, you need to have a separate net for each one, and you need to keep them separate. Anytime you share equipment is a chance to share disease. And of course, there's tons of stuff we don't have control over. Birds flying over, pooping on the pond. I have a great big, thick piece of rope tied between 2 trees over the center of my pond. And I sling my pond net over that to keep the fall leaves out. It turns out it's a really good place for birds to sit. And they love to sit there over my pond. And I scream and yell all the time about them pooping. Guys, you're welcome here, but don't poop in the pond. It doesn't seem to have any effect. Frogs are notorious for bringing all sorts of diseases into ponds, and yet we love them. And my husband's greatest joy is going out and counting the number of frogs he can see. So, you know, everything is good and bad, but you have to realize that there are things out of our control that are bringing pathogens into our ponds all the time. And that's why it's so important to prevent the disease and for the fish to have a really strong immune system and also a strong slime coat. Obviously, debris are pretty easy to fix because we can do bottom drains. If you don't have a bottom drain, you need to vacuum. Certainly need to remove rocks on the bottom, which are the greatest source for harboring disease. And a skimmer, if you don't have one, can be installed aftermarket and will prevent a lot of the debris from getting to the bottom of the pond. So you don't have so much for your filtration to remove. Okay, first rule, do no harm. That's a vet thing. But it also is for all of us who are keeping pets of any sort. And that means insert brain before you start doing things with your hands. If it's not an emergency, stop. Don't treat, observe, figure it out, come up with a plan of action, and then treat very specifically for a specific problem. Never treat anything unless you know the exact problem. You will cause resistances. By throwing chemicals into the pond, you will cause those chemicals to stop working for that group of fish. My story for this is when I started koi keeping, and yes, I know the dinosaurs were still in existence. It goes back a really long way. Our primary way to treat all problems in the pond was salt. And every parasite could be killed by salt. So you threw in 0.3 parts per thousand of salt, or 3,000 parts per million, 0.3 parts per thousand of salt, and all of the parasites died, and your pond was clean and you went on. 0.3 will harm many plants, but not all. So you even got away with it with some plants in the system. And koi keeping was pretty simple back then. Well, you know what happened is that, of course, the Japanese who are breeding these fish, the breeders need to make a living. They need to feed their families. And koi farming is like any other kind of farming. If you have a crop failure, you starve to death. You can't feed your family. So the Japanese, being very clever, figured out that if they started growing the fish in 0.3 salt, they would never have any problems. Yeah, that worked for a while. And then what happened was every parasite that we were getting was suddenly resistant to salt. It had no effect at 0.3. So we changed it to 0.4. And then that stopped having an effect. And then we changed it to 0.5 and that stopped having an effect. And we changed it to 0.6. And after that, you can't increase it anymore without the fish rolling over. So salt ceased to be a system that we could use. And to a great extent, that is still true today. One of the interesting science experiments, if you ever want a little cute, quick thing to do in your pond, in fact, don't do it in the pond, do it on a piece of paper, is figure out how many water changes it takes to get salt out of the pond. If you start with, say, 0.3 salt, how long does it take to get that down to almost not measurable? And you will be horrified at the calculation. So let's talk a little bit. We've talked about water quality. Remember, we said we were dividing it into 4 categories. The first one being water quality. The second one is parasites. We'll lump fungus in there with parasites. This is the time of year for fungus. As the water starts getting colder now for the next 6 months, this is when we see fungus. We don't usually see a lot of it in warm water, although it's possible. Remember that there are always parasites and fungus in your system. You know, it's kind of like fleas on dogs. One flea doesn't hurt anything, but it's when they start multiplying that you have a problem. And when would they start multiplying? Whenever the fish's immune system is not helping them, whenever their slime coat is missing. So you need to keep the fish as strong and healthy as possible all the time to try to prevent these things that are already in the water. Remember that parasites are very happy transferring from fish to fish. There are many parasites that have a free swimming stage where there are parasites loose in the water, horrors. And remember that one of the great places to harbor parasites is your filter. And so a lot of times when we're treating for parasites, you will have to treat the filter, which means the filter is going to take a hit and you're going to need some chemicals to help you get through until your filter starts working again. We're going to talk about those in a little bit. Remember that many parasites have a very complex life cycle. You can't just kill them by applying a chemical once. You've got to kill all the different life cycles of that parasite. And for ick, it could take 6 treatments. And like every 3 days, depending on water temperature, it might be every other day, might be every 4 days. It may take many, many more treatments than the manufacturer originally had suggested in order to get all the life cycles and really do 100% kill. Remember that again, parasites and fungus or any stressor suppresses the fish's immune system. So it's cyclical. The worse the fish are, the worse they become. If you can keep them healthy, they stay healthy. But the minute you start having a problem, it's a downward spiral. So you need to be able to try to prevent these things from happening. Symptoms, parasites. Well, of course, the first symptom you see may be death. That's always real hard to work with. But look for things like flashing, fish being alone, staying at a water source on the bottom, clamped fins, jumping, erratic swimming, frantic swimming, not eating, lots and lots of symptoms. Again, if you're a good observer and you know your koi, you'll know when they're doing abnormal things. And that's when you're going to start looking for problems. You know, people always say to me, well, my fish flash every day. Yep. Lots of fish flash every day. A lot of times fish will flash when the pH changes because the sun goes under a cloud. That's how sensitive the fish are. However, one flash randomly by a single fish or even 1 or 2 means nothing. If you start seeing consistent flashing, especially from a single fish or a group of fish, that's when you start noticing there's a problem. Fungus appears as cottony growth, could be in the gills, but it could be anywhere. And again, symptoms are going to be very, very similar to parasites. But usually in fungus, there's usually some kind of gill component. So also look for anything where the fish might be seeking more oxygen. How do we treat these things? So again, prevent, keep your system clean. If you have parasites, how do you know you have parasites? Lisa, Kevin, Rebecca, somebody, how do you know you have parasites? Because you have,
Microscope.
yes, you have done a scrape and scope, and you've looked under the microscope and you have figured out which parasite you have, because we treat them a little bit differently, and you may need to do different dosing with different parasites. Do not assume that you have parasites if you have not seen them. I had one lady who swore to me that her fish were flashing because of parasites. And after numerous scrapes and scopes on numerous fish, we never found a single one. That's good news. Of course, the bad news is there was something much worse. But we can treat if we know what it is. Different things require different treatment. That goes for parasites, that also goes for bacteria. Basically, ciliated parasites, anything but flukes, anchorworm, and lice, those three we have to treat separately, but all the others we usually treat with Proform C. Remember that you cannot use Proform C with salt. It creates embalming fluid. You will be literally embalming your fish. Don't do it. You need to get salt out of the pond before you even think about using Proform C. Proform C now comes with a warning on the label not to use with salt. Ask me how it got there, because of one of the cases that I was working on, that they now put a warning on the label. Proform C is a broad spectrum. It will take care of all the ciliated parasites except for the flukes, the anchorworms, and lice. It won't hurt the filter plants or animals, so it's pretty safe. Use as directed. That does not mean it's pretty safe. If you dump an entire bottle in a small pond, you will kill everything very quickly. Used as directed, it's pretty safe. Usually the bottle tells you to do 3 days in a row. And my caveat there is, depending on what you're hunting, if you've got ick, it may be a lot more than that. And days in a row is based on having a standard pond temperature of about 70, 75 degrees. Very rarely do most of us have this standard temperature. It's either warmer or cooler. If it's warmer, you may have to treat more often. If it's cooler, you have to treat less often. Basically, treatments always have to be based on the fish's own rhythms, which come from the water. Remember that everything's tuned to water temperature. And so the fish can recover from things very quickly in warm water, but it also means they get sick faster in warm water. If you want to slow down some disease, put the fish in cooler water. It buys you some time. Always a good thing. If you have flukes, remember there are two kinds of flukes, but if you have flukes, Prazi is the #1 treatment. These days, I've heard all sorts of crazy things. Oh, they've got this Prazi Plo, and they've got all these other things that have Prazi in them. You know what? Prazi works exactly the same as it always did. It works on all worms, virtually in every animal and living creature. We use Prazi for people, even down to very small children. We use it for cats, dogs, horses, cows, chickens, sheep, anything you can think of. Again, used as directed, it's very, very safe. My caveat again is it may take more than one treatment. When Prazi first became available on the market for koi, one treatment gave you 100% kill every time. But now we raise fish in Prazi just like we used to do salt and Proform C. So we do not see getting 100% kill. Remember that if you don't get 100% kill, what's left? The ones that are resistant. If you use the Prazi once and some parasites survive, those are the ones that are Prazi resistant. And if you leave them what will they do? Breed more Prasi-resistant parasites. And at some point, Prasi won't be working in your pond. It sometimes takes, I'm simplifying and it may take some generations, but remember that it's important that you get 100% kill anytime you're trying to kill parasites. If you have anchor worms and lice, you can use something called Proform LA. I've never seen anchor worms and lice in a hobbyist home pond. I see it always in mud ponds. I have seen a few really dirty ponds where I wondered if they had anchor worms or lice, but I haven't actually seen it. Maybe your experience is different. But Proform LA is, again, very, very safe. Used as directed, won't hurt the filter plants or animals. Okay, quickly on to bacterial disease. So a lot of you have goldfish, and goldfish seem very much less susceptible to bacterial disease than koi do. I'm not sure why. I've talked to some goldfish experts, and it just doesn't seem to be as much of a problem for them. I don't know if that's because they are just evolved to be more resistant. They have in general better slime coat. I don't know, but it is a serious problem with koi. It's generally caused by anaerobic bacteria. I would say almost 100% of the time it has to do with some kind of dirty debris accumulation, because that's where these anaerobic, the bacteria that cannot live in air, they have to be in some place where they're not exposed to air, and that means they're hiding in mulm and debris, or your filter or something like that. And so debris accumulation is almost always associated with some kind of bacterial disease, although we do see it in very clean ponds as well. Crowding because of the stress, bad circulation or a dirty filter, very, very common to see it. Symptoms, again, first symptom, death, not useful. But generally, the thing you're looking for is ulcers, any kind of sores, any red sore on the side of the fish, specifically maybe sores around their mouth or their fins, or maybe you're seeing their fins or their mouth sort of dissolving, disappearing. We call it mouth rot or fin rot, but it means that their fins are sort of dissolving away. Ulcers are very often not obvious because they happen on a red scale, or they happen on a fish that has lots of red scales, and they're very hard to see. So in order to find them on a fish that has a lot of red, sometimes if you've ruled out parasites and you've ruled out viruses and your water quality is looking good, you probably are going to have to take that fish into a bowl, maybe with some anesthesia, and take a really good look at that fish, very close, get your eyeballs on, and look for anything that may be affecting under the scales or in the scale pockets. Infections happen there a lot. Erratic swimming, lethargy, ain't doing well. I mean, those are symptoms of every disease, but we think of it a lot. Lethargy in bacterial disease is probably, I would say, the one I see the most often. And remember that it happens in a lot of cases that I see, maybe not so many you see, that we can get bacterial infections that are not on the surface. They are systemic. They're in the blood and they're inside the fish, just like we get internal bacterial infections. They don't show anywhere. You can't see them on an exam. And the only way to find them is to do a blood draw. And that's something you're going to want to talk to either one of the experts from KOI or your vet about getting done. So what can we do? Remember the first thing we talked about, do no harm. What that means is you need to start with the least invasive treatments and work your way up. Don't start with invasive things, which might push the koi over the edge and kill it. Start with simple things. Water change reduces the parasite load, reduces the bacteria, reduces pretty much anything harmful in the water. So start with a big water change. Remember that you don't want to stress them out with the water change. That means putting in water at the same temperature you took it out, and that your water quality parameters need to be somewhat similar, although maybe not critical that they're absolutely identical. You can try making some medicated food if the fish are eating. That is a great way to get antibiotics in the fish without having to touch the fish. If you can avoid touching them because of the additional stress involved with that. Bifurin is a waterborne treatment for bacterial disease. It can be used in a big pond. I don't recommend it because of the cost. Most ponds under, say, 10,000 gallons, it's fine. If you're worried about that, you're going to need to move the koi to a show tank or to a smaller body of water to do the treatment. And again, the minute you have to touch the fish, now you're adding stressors, and that can cause the fish to get sicker. But if you can add it to the pond, and especially if you think you've got bacteria hiding somewhere in the pond, like in filters, now you're going to want to add the bifurin to the whole pond and run it through the filters, even though the filters will take a bit of a hit. If that's all not working, we step it up, and maybe we try some medicated ointment or Tricide Neo. Both of those are going to require you catching the fish, perhaps anesthetizing the fish, and then spraying or treating it with a topical ointment. Those work pretty well, but it's a lot more harmful to the fish than not having to touch it. And if all else fails, if nothing is solving your problem, if you've tried the Tricide Neo, you've tried the bifurin, and it's just not going away, it's turning into a chronic thing, you need to get the ulcer swabbed and send it off to a lab for culture and sensitivity, and then you're going to need to get a vet to give antibiotics based on what the culture and sensitivity found. You all know that there are, I think, probably thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of strains of bacteria out there in the world. It's like shooting the wrong parasite. If you treat for the wrong thing, you won't get a kill, or at least you won't get 100% kill. You need to send the culture off to the lab, find out exactly what strain of bacteria is causing the problem, and then use an antibiotic that will get you 100% kill. Okay, last, certainly not least, are viruses. There is no cure. We have no COVID vaccines for koi. Luckily, COVID is not something that affects koi. There are only a few things that affect koi: koi herpes virus, spring viremia of carp, which, by the way, is a reportable disease. If the government, when you get spring viremia carp, it's reported to the government comes in, it's like hoof and mouth. They kill everything and they clean everything, and you start over. It's very rare these days, usually seen at the dealer or the grower level, usually never seen in small hobbyist home ponds, but it does happen, and you could have been sent a fish that had SVC from a dealer or from somebody who was growing it. And so we're going to mention it here. There's also a couple of other viruses, possibly sleeping sickness. Hukui, we think maybe, is also a virus. All of these can only be prevented. There is no cure. So know your fish source. Quarantine. Who quarantines? So the breeder should quarantine before he sells the fish. The dealer who gets the fish should quarantine the fish again. And then you, as the end person with the fish, should quarantine a third time. Very important. Quarantining is not hard. It doesn't have to be a large tank. You do need to control the temperature. In your case, maybe I should say ice would be more common to control the temperature. You can go out and buy great big blocks of ice and keep the temperature cooler. Sometimes in a small tank, the temperature rises very quickly. And when it gets much above 80, that's really too high. I would say 80 is a top range for treating for disease and for quarantining. You don't want to go much above that and keep the fish there. I mean, that's fine in your pond where they can escape it a little bit, but not so much in a small tank. In my neck of the woods, we use aquarium heaters. And don't forget, you always have to have an air stone. And the caveat to that is don't use one air stone, use two. Don't put them on a single air pump, use two air pumps and plug the air pumps into different circuits. Now, why am I this crazy? I'm this crazy because there is one thing that will kill all the fish very quickly in a small tank, and that's lack of oxygen. That's why at koi shows, we have a mandatory non-negotiable requirement of koi shows having a generator to handle the air pump. And they also have to have a spare air pump on hand at the show site, or we will not be involved with the show. And philosophically, you should never take your fish to a show if they're not doing that sort of thing. Make sure that you're have double security for oxygen, because that will kill everything in the tank much faster than any disease. A couple of hours tops. Remember that filtration is not required in a quarantine tank. And in fact, I recommend you don't use filtration. Do not filter a quarantine tank. If you're only keeping fish, anytime you're keeping fish less than what it takes to start a filter. I don't know, how long does it take down there? 6 weeks? You know, can you do it in 4? Somewhere down there. Up in New England, we always say 6 to 8 weeks to start a filter. If you're keeping fish for less than that, use chemicals. Using a filter will only cause more problems. It takes too long to start them. There will be water quality issues. They're putting the filter in the tank is a problem. Putting it out of the tank is a problem. There's just too many issues. Don't do it. Use the chemicals. 2 chemicals that KOI has tested and approved. We got into issues recently with people wanting to use other chemicals. I know there are other people making chemicals and they say it's just like Ultimate or it works just the same as Chlormex. And I would say to you, don't do it. They have not been tested and approved. How do we know that Ultimate and Chlormex are safe? Well, first of all, Ultimate is half Chlormex and half of a polymer plastic that actually coats the fish and replaces their slime coat, but only where it's missing. So if your fish is perfectly healthy, the Ultimate part, the slime coat part of the Ultimate in the water does absolutely nothing, and it just sits there waiting to be used. However, when your fish do a little flashing, or they rub against the bottom, or they bump up against another fish, they scrape off some slime coat. If that Ultimate is in the water, the slime coat is replaced instantly. And you have no portal of entry for either parasites or bacteria. I have found, my personal experience in the last 10 years, that if every time my fish are stressed about something, I throw a gallon of Ultimate in the pond and my fish never gets sick. I have not had a sick fish in over 10 years. Now, I had one die from egg binding, but I don't think that counts. That's not sickness per se. So how do we know that Ultimate is safe? Because fish can live in 100% pure Ultimate. We did it. It was tested. We took something like 65 small fish, 4 to 6 inches, put them in a tank, 100-gallon tank with 100 gallons of Ultimate, put a net over the top and walked away for a month. And those fish were all fine at the end of the month. They can live in 100% pure Ultimate. And Chlormex is just one of the components of Ultimate. The advantage of Chlormex is that it can be powdered. We cannot powder Ultimate because it has that polymer plastic in it that needs to be a liquid, but the Chlormex can be powdered, and therefore it's a heck of a lot cheaper to ship and a heck of a lot easier to store and a lot more stable. You know, you can keep it for, I don't think there is a shelf life on Chlormex. Assuming you don't expose it to extreme temperatures, is probably good for more than 20 years. And so what we recommend is that when you're starting a quarantine tank, do what we do with show tanks. Add Ultimate as your first dose and then alternate dose with Chloromex from then on. And it's just a whole lot cheaper. So we've talked about stress and how that causes outbreaks. Remember, change is bad. If there's one thing koi like, it's stability. Make sure that your water quality, which is always the most important thing, that is always good. Don't crowd the fish, be a good observer. Parasites are prevented with having good slime coat. Bacteria generally require both a good slime coat and cleanliness in the pond. And of course, with viruses, we have no cure. We just quarantine to avoid it. Okay. Anybody questions, comments, discussion? Whipped through a lot of stuff pretty quick, but most of you have heard all this before, so hopefully it was just a refresher. Rebecca, Lisa, Kevin, comments?
Actually, I learned a lot.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's a few people that haven't heard all this stuff, Karen. So, you know, and for me, it's Groundhog Tuesday all the time for me. So it's, you know, it's always a great refresher, and it's empowering to me to go, oh, I knew that. I want to give you a compliment. Your graphics are freaking amazing. I love your graphics. They are so awesome.
So I actually used to sell graphics packages back in my former life when I worked for a living and I was a sales slime. And I have collected the most amazing collection of fish clip art. And so I think slides should be fun and entertaining.
They are awesomeness.
They are great.
Awesomeness.
Karen, I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a pond with, I did have 8 huge fish. I mean, they're all between 2 and 3 feet long, and
They were whales, Karen, whales.
30 to 40 pounds. Anyway, unfortunately, we had a lightning strike this spring. It hit my pecan tree, went down through the landscape lighting system, blew out a whole bunch of stuff, and it electrocuted the koi. And,
all of them? Usually lightning finds its way through to ground. And usually when we see a lightning strike, it's only one or a few fish in one area that are affected. But I could see if you shorted the whole system, you probably were getting it from every direction. So that could explain it.
Yeah, see, there was a light in the pond. I'll never put another one in, but it went through the whole lighting system. And I ran to the door when I saw the flash and heard the noise, and I saw all the fish were jumping straight out of the water, and they all turned belly up. Now, one by one, about 4, I lost a couple right away, and then 4 of them seemed to be not really affected. They lay upside down for a while, and then they gradually turn back over. 1 died immediately. 2 hung in there for a month, 2 months, and I thought maybe they'd be okay, but they were just, I think their backs were broken. They swam kind of weird. They couldn't
crooked.
really,
Yeah.
Yeah, they finally died. I have this one, my biggest fish right now, that he looked like he was affected a little bit, but we didn't think it was going to be that much. Well, he's just been going downhill. And he's to the point now where he just stays in the corner all the time. But this last week, he has started doing this crazy corkscrew swimming, just like the others before they died. So I need to know how to euthanize a fish, because I think he's
yeah.
You know.
Let me make a couple of comments. I've seen a lot of lightning cases, and I've seen koi that are bent into a U shape such that they cannot swim basically at all. I mean, they kind of paddle around and go in circles. And I've seen
a couple of them, yeah.
Well, I've seen koi survive that for several years.
Really?
And the one specific koi I'm thinking of finally died probably 4.5 years after the initial lightning strike, because in that U, in the inside of the U there, those scales were all deformed because the fish was so bent, and it ended up with a bacterial infection in those scales, and that we just could not clear the bacterial infection. It just wouldn't. And I think that, you know, anytime there's something that traumatic, you very likely are seeing some longer term effects. But I would also tell you that I had a lightning strike in one of my previous ponds, affected one fish, and the fish came out in a Z or S shape. It was a zigzag, okay?
Wow.
But it was a young fish, maybe 2 years old, 2.5. And by the time that koi was 8, only I could see it. I knew what to look for, but it had straightened itself back out. And that's just on that list of amazing recuperative powers and superpowers that fish have. Mammals aren't related. Fish are just unique, and they can survive things that we wouldn't think they could. And I think that I think my guess is that there's more going on than the lightning strike. I'm guessing when you're talking about a fish that has been relatively well for a period of months and suddenly is doing corkscrew swimming, I'm guessing you've got some kind of toxin that's been introduced recently.
Well,
Corkscrew swimming is toxin. Normally, when we see electrocution, it's not corkscrew, it'll be zigzaggy or jerky or irregular, but
yeah,
not,
it's,
you know,
that's pretty much what it is. I mean, I said
okay.
corkscrew, but it's like a large corkscrew. They just kind of go around and around the pond. And I mean, it just looks exactly like the other ones that happened right after the lightning strike. And I kept telling my husband that I thought this one was going to make it, but it's just, it hasn't been eating it. And I mean, it's just been going downhill steadily since the lightning strike.
So for euthanasia, the best solution is an overdose of anesthetic, just like we do for virtually every other animal. And I highly would recommend MS-222. It's much easier. The fish induces faster, and you can use clove oil, you can use 2-PE. You do a massive overdose, but then you also have to leave the fish in the water for a very long time. Do not assume that after a half an hour that the fish is dead just because it stopped gilling. Its heart could be beating for an hour after it stops breathing. And so, so the most important thing to know about euthanasia is that you overdose, wait until the fish stops breathing, and then leave it for an hour. Just throw a cover on it and kind of set it aside and kind of let it depart the world very peacefully and very quietly. Most fish react a bit when they enter the overdose of anesthetic. That is purely physical and not mental. So don't let it upset you. They may have a reaction when they enter the anesthetic, but you mustn't think badly about that. That just happens. So so use whatever anesthetic you can get your hands on. I prefer MS-222. My second choice would be 2-PE. Those you can get from the KOI website if you are a CKK or you have CKKs in your club like Lisa and Kevin and Rebecca, hopefully soon going to start the program. But we make things available to our people, and that's one of them. And Lisa's holding up, was that 2-PE?
Yeah, it's the MS-22.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know, you know what size vial this goes out in, Kevin?
Yeah, tiny vial. What you want to do is you want to get the fish in the smallest amount of water possible. So you're going to want to put it in a bowl or in a bag. And so you don't have a ton of water, and then you're going to, drastically overdose the anesthetic. That A, makes it cheaper, and B, makes it more effective and more humane.
Well,
Can Kevin give us the formula for that?
Yes, I'll get with Kimberly on that.
Okay. But I thought Kevin, if she, I'm closer to her if she needs to get it done soon.
well, I need to find out kind of how much, because this is like a 30-pound fish. I mean, this
Yeah.
is one of my big ones.
Actually, it doesn't take a lot. but it may take more than, I doubt it would take more than what's in that vial. That's a pretty good, that's gotta be, I don't know. Do you know how much it holds, Kevin?
No, actually, that looks like the one that you get when you're
With the lab
taking
kit.
Yeah,
CJK
this was with the
course.
lab kit.
Yeah, with the lab kit.
So
This is-
that's,
When it's purchased through the KY store, it's this size. It's 100 gram. That one is probably, I would guess, maybe 20 grams or something.
even less maybe. Yeah. Yeah. But that should be enough. 20 grams should be more than enough to euthanize the fish, even a large fish, assuming you do put it in a small amount of water. So remember that when we ship fish, we don't ship any more water than we absolutely have to, because water is heavy, in case you haven't noticed.
Yeah.
And so when we ship fish, we only need to cover their gills. Their backbone and their dorsal fin does not need to be in water. So you want to do the same thing when you're doing euthanasia. You don't need a big chunk of water or do it in a large bowl or a large bag or anything. Just water to cover the gills. And then, dose, and generally we tend to mix the anesthesia agent into the water before adding the koi. And Kevin or Lisa can help you with that, because they've all done it.
So I could get a big tub and put like a big garbage bag inside it and just
Sure.
that I just to contain it like that.
Like that-
Absolutely.
Like
And
that
that's
tub that you have the ice and beer in for the Halloween party.
and then use a bag that's not too much bigger than your koi. And then as you're adding water, just figure out you don't want to add more water than what is needed to cover the gills. So use as small a bag in a container as possible. You don't really want the fish to be terribly uncomfortable. So you should be able to not be in a curve, but you don't want anything large because it's going to take too much water and too much drug to achieve it. So small as possible. But a good advantage of lining a bowl with a bag like that is then once the fish is expired, you can dump the water out and you've got a nice neat bag with which to bury the fish in. Save it from, and I personally, my dead fish have really improved my rose garden over the years. And every time I see a rose blooming, I think about the fish.
Oh.
And it's kind of it's kind of nice. So yeah, they're really beneficial. You do have to bury them fairly deep though, or things dig them up in the first week or two.
Yeah, my
At least
problem
around
is
here.
finding- I don't know where I can find in my yard that it wouldn't be disturbed, because I buried one of those gigantic ones in a place that I thought would never be dug up. And then I decided to build a greenhouse, and I had some guys go out and start digging, and guess what they ran into?
Fish
Oh, good
bones.
Lord, that was a smelly nightmare.
Oh, it was
Oh,
horrible. It was
Oh.
horrible. I thought these two guys were gonna faint,
it was horrifying weeks later. It was horrifying.
If you wait long enough, it's not a problem. It's just a matter of not digging there for the first year.
No, yeah, this was about 3-4 months after.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
I have a friend who accidentally dug up a horse. That
Oh.
was
Oh, God.
that was really bad. So at least, always look on the bright side. It could have been worse.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, I've been teaching horses since I've been a little girl, and I've always been involved with horses. And boy, dead horses are really tough. It's really hard to get rid of a horse.
No kidding.
Up here in New England, we have enough veterinary schools that they always want subjects. So normally what you do is quick call a vet school and they'll come and take them away, and they'll actually do a necropsy and tell you what it died from if you didn't already know.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I wouldn't have thought of that. Yeah,
Always make use of the free services. when possible.
absolutely.
No kidding.
I'm donating my body personally so I can get the free cremation whenever they're done with me.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we all realize that when we reach a point where the koi is just, you're not able to recover them. And sometimes it's really hard to know where that line is. So I'll tell you a quick story. I get called in on bad cases. Rarely do I get when you dig a hole in the ground, yes, you have to put a liner and a filter in it. I mean, you get those a lot in the beginning, but as you've been around for too long, now I get the interesting stuff. So I occasionally get really, really interesting cases. And I had a vet call me and tell me that she would not believe what just showed up in her clinic. Somebody brought a koi in, bag of water and a koi, and it's just a J random pond fish, not not anything most of us would consider giving water for. It was just a self spawn, from somebody's backyard pond, and it had ulcers. And so she tested the ulcers and she take a look. There was not an antibiotic known to man that would attack that strain of bacteria. And she called me up to say, it's really scary because this bacteria is out there in this J random pond. And if that got into people, there's no cure for this thing. I mean, not only can I not help their fish, but, God forbid, we all need to just be more careful. And so, it was kind of a little warning, but there is bad stuff out there. And we can't cure everything. And sometimes, we think that a fish is on its last legs. I was called to another pond and I got there and the fish was bleeding from its scales.
Oh,
Okay.
gosh.
They bleed from their gills. Yes, when they're stressed and their blood pressure goes wonky and they bleed from their gills. And that's not too bad. That's not ever life-threatening. But this fish was so far gone that it was bleeding between every scale. And I was like, oh my God. I mean, like, how fast can I euthanize this poor fish? Put it out of its misery. And the homeowner was insistent that we give it injections. And she'd gone to her local vet and she'd gotten this super expensive, she had like $500 of antibiotics sitting there and she really wanted to inject this fish. And I was like, I don't even think about, that fish was so far gone. I'm thinking, man, it's just cruel to practice injecting it, but yeah, I figured, there was the only way we was going to shut her up. So I showed her, or she did the injection. I kibitzed on the side and she did the injection. Do you know that damn fish is alive today?
Oh, wow.
I mean, that fish was dead. I'm telling you, it was dead. It could not maintain vertical hold. It was rolled over. It was bleeding from every scale. And after the injections, we put it back in the little pond, the other fish gathered around it and pushed it upright.
Wow.
So that it wasn't lying on its side. Now, you could maybe think of an excuse like maybe they were all noodling around in the plants on the edge of the pond together and it was, some kind of thing. But I think the other fish knew that fish was in problem and it needed help and they were able to go and help it stay upright. I've heard of other people's telling me that healthy fish will help a sick fish stay upright.
Oh, yes.
So,
but the ones that eventually died when they first were sick and they were having a hard time staying up, the other fish definitely would come up underneath it and put it upright.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
I think it's just so amazing. And we think these creatures are dumb. So apparently the other fish kind of babysat this thing and it got well. And she did go and inject all $500 worth of antibiotics into it. I'm sure that had something to do with it, but
Wow.
I'm just saying that from my viewpoint, there was no question at all that the fish should be euthanized. And you see, these things happen. Fish are amazing. So I don't want to discourage you from euthanasia, but I will tell you that fish have an amazing ability to survive things that we just wouldn't think possible. and I'm
Well, if I could
constantly
think of
amazed.
anything to do for this one,
Yeah.
but
No, and I think that that's probably a really good assessment. I mean, I think this lady, if she had euthanized that fish, that would have been a really good decision, possibly a better decision than making it recover. But, she did get it to recover, and it is happy and healthy still years later. So go figure.
wow.
Just go figure.
Go fish.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly. But you don't want
Wow.
to get me started. I can do fish stories forever.
Man, that's amazing.
They are amazing creatures. Whenever we do necropsies for demos and labs and things, it takes a really long time to make sure the fish is dead. And I would tell you that in one particularly horrible situation, we started cutting up the fish and it wasn't dead. Yeah, and that's just really bad. And so that's why I'm so insistent on telling you that you really need to give it an hour to expire after it stops breathing. Stopping breathing is not indicative of death in a fish. If you were to take that fish apart during the next half an hour, you will see the heart still beating.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it takes a while. So, and if you can ignore it for 3 or 4 hours, you'll feel better.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, philosophically, once you take it out of water, it is not going to recover. So yeah, but I always just tell people, put a cover over it, leave the bowl on the side, ignore it for a while. It'll be fine.
Let
And
it
then
bake for an hour. Yeah.
Yeah, and find a good place. I highly recommend digging the hole first, while you can kind of figure out how big it needs to be. It's hard. The worst thing ever happened to me is one winter I lost a fish. Not exactly sure what was going on, but I suspect it was an internal bacterial infection that the fish had just not been doing well for about 2 years. And excuse me, kind of like you, it had been kind of just spiraling downhill. And it tied in the middle of winter under the ice. And I'm seeing this thing floating under the ice. And I'm like, oh, I got to get it out of the pond before it, affects the water quality for the others. And, finally, after much struggling, I was able to melt a big enough hole in the ice to be able to get the thing. Of course, it moved the minute the circulation of the pond was moving it away. And finally, we got the thing out. Wow, what a struggle. It took me, I'd say, the better part of 4 hours to get it out of the pond. We get it out of the pond, and then I'm like, what am I thinking? I can't bury it anywhere. The ground's frozen solid, and there's 10 feet of snow, now what? So we kind of left the frozen fish in the garage, and then we bagged it up really well and kind of went to the local dump. Normally, I would much prefer to bury them, but this was I'm desperate.
I had a fish pass away while I was away. And so my neighbors are watching the dogs and the birds and feeding the fish. And they noticed the last goldfish in the pond. And she had to be 12 or 13 years old anyway. And so her first text was, do I use standard procedure and bag it and put it in the freezer? And I'm like, yes, please.
Yeah. I used to have a buddy, my mentor in Koi, actually, and his wife was never happy with him because every time she went to the freezer, she had to look very carefully at the labels to make sure that she was taking out the dinner rather than the dead fish that he had stored in the freezer.
Exactly.
He always had dead fish in his freezer because he liked to necropsy things. Yeah, and actually it gets harder once they've been frozen too. So
this was a case of, I don't want to dispose of it until the day of, the pickup, so that
exactly
it wasn't stinking up everything. And I told her, I said, I don't think I have room for this fish was so big. I said, I don't think I have room in my little freezer. Don't put my fish in your freezer. I know that would gross you out. Just take my food and put it in your freezer.
There you go.
To make room for the fish. So Karen, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry for the lower numbers, but we had all the very special, important people here.
Well, that's right. And hey, if each of you got one helpful little hint, then that we've done well for the evening. And that
Well,
always
and
is
we've
good.
got it recorded, so we will put it up on our website and on our Facebook page for people to access. So it'll be a permanent education point for everyone to take a look at. And I don't know what's going on. Perhaps it's just, that time of year.
We've noticed at all online meetings, there have been a lot less people, kind of gradually declining as the year's gone on. I think people are just really sick of online. We've been doing this COVID online meeting thing
Yeah.
now for a long time, and people are just so ready to do something else.
Yeah.
They don't even need a good excuse anymore. Hey, there's something on TV, I'm watching that.
Yeah. Well, I know Mike Lorfing and I both are Toastmasters. And so we are just absolutely beat down with having to do, there's a lot to be said for the convenience of having a Zoom meeting, and we never could have had you speak at a meeting without Zoom. So we appreciate that, but just not being able to be in person and get that audience response, it can be frustrating. So
It's hard as a speaker. You all know, if you're doing
it's
Zoom
horrible.
meetings, it's
horrible
hard
as a
because you
speaker.
don't see the people, you don't get the feedback, you don't know if you're going too fast or too slow, or they're laughing at your jokes, or maybe they're laughing at you.
Exactly.
And it's,
Or they just went away and didn't come back.
oh, there you go.
You
Yeah,
know?
that happens too.
Yeah.
No
We
problem.
really do appreciate it, Karen. I know I personally have learned a lot, so I thank you very, very much.
Well, and I think maybe you have a new enrollee as a result of your talk,
Excellent.
Karen.
Hey,
So
that's worth it all. I'm telling
it
you.
is.
And
It absolutely is.
it's great that your club has several people that have experience and can help everyone else. And the goal, when KOA started, one of the things we wanted to do is make sure we had a certified person in every club. We're getting there. Maybe not quite there yet, but some clubs have 4 and 5, but some of them don't have any yet. The other biggest problem we have is that so many people are not covered by clubs. Up here in New England, there really isn't a club for us. MAKC, well, that's Mid-Atlantic. They meet somewhere south of Pennsylvania. It's more than 6 hours for anybody. And that's, if you live close to the border. And then for a while, Boston had a club, and they're kind of on again, off again. And it's like Connecticut never did a club, but we all get together and go out to dinner once in a while. I think that counts. So, but it's hard for a lot of parts of the country. And of course, now we're seeing a lot more international people. We have a couple of Canadian clubs, and we're able to help a lot more people in Canada and in other parts of the world where they're keeping koi, where they may not have access to a club. So we're here. Well, anyway, thank you folks for inviting me, and I'll sign off. If y'all want to continue meeting and having fun, you do that. And again, Rebecca, I expect to see your application for CKK tomorrow.
Okay, I plan to do it.
Looking forward to working with you. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
You have a good evening.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Karen.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. That was an awesome program. So let me stop recording it again.